Okay, let's get going. So we'll continue with chapter 6 and macroeconomic measurements. So we left off last time discussing price level statistics, inflation and deflation, and CPI, consumer price index, the main statistical tool that tracks the data about prices used for a variety of purposes, including the adjustments of incomes to take into account inflation. That's the last thing that we discussed, that actually consumer price index is a very useful tool for governments and economists to try and adjust especially the incomes that are fixed, such as long-term salaries or social security and other welfare payments, to account for the changing cost of living. Actually, if you have inflation, 4%, typically the incomes will be, so the payments will be accordingly adjusted to retain the same purchasing power. So there's one interesting formula that you can use actually to see how this works and how simple it is actually. So you pick and choose two arbitrary years, 2020 and 2016. Let's say that you want to calculate whatever salary in 2016 was $50,000. That's a fixed salary. Somebody's paid. And now let's say that CPI, Consumer Price Index, in the year 2006. That's year 1, this is year 2. The CPI was 165. We know how CPI is calculated. And then CPI 2 for year 2020, let's say 173. So now the question that you're asking here is, having in mind this change in the price level between 2 years, between 2016 and 2020, what would be an equivalent salary in 2020, which will have the same purchasing power as $50,000 in 2016? And the formula is very simple. Let's say the salary number 2 in the year 2020 would correspond to salary 1 times CPI 2 over CPI 1. So of course you will need to, because the inflation increased in the meantime, you will have to increase the nominal income, the nominal wage from 50,000 to 50 something. You can calculate it easily now. CPI 2 is 173 over 165, so that would be 1.1 or something like that. And then you multiply 50,000 times 1 point something, you will get a larger number. You will get maybe 52, 3, whatever the number is. So that's the way how this is done. So you can do it in reverse. Then you can say, I have now $50,000. This is salary number 2 is in 2020. Salary number 1 is in 2016. This is CPI 2020. CPI 2016. You can say I have $50,000 annual wage right now with the same consumer price indexes for 2 years. You may ask, what is the equivalent? What would be the equivalent of my wage if I were my grandfather, for example, if his instead of 2016, 1965? What would be the equivalent salary in 1965? it would have been much lower. Equivalent to $50,000 or something like that, I don't know, $7,000 or $8,000. Approximately. Okay, so you can compare incomes across time, correcting for inflation. That's how it is. Anyway, questions about this? So we're going to move on. This was the last thing that I just wanted to add on the previous more general and theoretical discussion. Today we're going to move to unemployment. So what is the most widely used statistical measure of unemployment that we read about every day? What is it called?
Is it just the unemployment rate?
Yeah, unemployment rate. That's the most important one. There are others as well. Unemployment rate. There's also employment rate. And I think that's kind of silly, actually. If you know the unemployment rate, you know exactly the employment rate. But it's not that simple, you will see. The employment rate is calculated differently than unemployment rate. You cannot you cannot know directly the employment rate in an economy if you know the unemployment rate. And there is another statistical measure that is called, I'll just write the abbreviation, labor market participation rate. Labor market participation. I'll explain in a moment what is that. How that works. Okay, in order to understand how we calculate those kinds of things, unemployment rates, employment rates, labor market participation rate. These three will be the most important statistical measures of the labor market. Now, I say statistical measures that we are measuring the unemployment rate and labor market participation and other things. That's not quite precise, actually. What economists do, they're actually estimating. So you don't literally measure, you don't literally register in some gigantic database every person who gets a job or who loses the job, and then you just sum it up and they say, this is the number, this is the exact number. We're actually estimating what's going on. Estimating by using the usual statistical methods, creating a representative sample of households, typically thousands of households in America, using the techniques that other pollsters and people who export public opinion do, and then you follow what's happening in employment and unemployment figures, those representative households. Okay, so these are estimates, bear in mind. These are not exact measures. So you use a representative sample, and it says that the unemployment rate in December was 3.6%. That means that by and large, the unemployment rate in the United States, if you were to know the exact figure, should be close to 3.6%. Confidence interval maybe should, depending on what level of confidence, 95% level. The departure from that figure is smaller or larger, depending on how reliable your statistical measure is. But it's typically good enough approximation for estimate. Now, what is the technique? How those estimates are made? Okay, so it's a household surveys done on a weekly basis. What is the universe of people who are involved here? So unemployment rate would be percentage of some number who are unemployed. What is the denominator when you calculate unemployment rate? The unemployment rate is the number of people who are unemployed divided by some number. What is that number? Is it total population? Is it total adult population? What is it? So let's say you have first total population.
Is it like people that are able to work?
Yeah, people who are, what do you mean by able to work?
Like, they don't have disabilities or.
That could be, okay? There are two groups of people. You can divide up the country into two groups. The first one is the group of people who can work, as you said. So they have to satisfy certain criteria. So this is the first criteria. Those are the people between 16 and 65. Those people who are legally allowed to work by and large. The second criterion is they don't work for the military. It's military personnel is excluded. And the final exclusion criterion is that they are, as it is called usually, non-institutionalized population. They are not institutionalized. It's a fancy way of saying they're not in jail or in a mental institution confined on a long-term basis. So people in jail or people confined to mental institutions on a long-term basis are not part of this group of people who can work. Non-institutionalized means not in jail, not in a mental institution. So this entire group, this would be maybe, who knows, 85%, 90% of total population would be civil, not non-institutionalized population. Total civil, non-institutionalized population. And here would be people who are remaining, children, older people, military. They cannot work. Or not counted as a part of potential labor force. Now, this group, which is total civil population, non-institutionalized civil population, is then divided into two groups. So there's three. Here, the first one is, I can call it labor force. And another one, you can call it by a different name. You can call it discouraged workers or people who are outside of the labor market, who are part of the non-total civil population available for work, but who do not participate in the labor market. I'll explain in a second what does it mean to say that they are not participating in the labor market. So they're out of the labor market. And now finally, the final distinction here, or final branching, would be the labor force could be divided into two groups. employed and unemployed. So now you may ask, what is the difference then? These people who are out of the labor market, who qualify for job, who can work if they can, if they wanted, and unemployed, what is the difference? Why unemployed are technically part of the labor force, whereas those people here are outside of the labor force? What is the criterion for inclusion among the unemployed or for those who are outside of the labor force? Discouraged. The criterion is whether somebody is actively searching for a job. That means that you are checking in the Social Security Administration, you're applying for the jobs regularly, you're responding when they offer you a job, you accept it, and so on. So the criterion for being classified as an unemployed person is that you're actively seeking a job. Over the last whatever criterion is 3 months. Whereas people who are outside of the labor market, they don't have a job and they don't try to find it. So that's the division. You have first the total population, you have total adult population available for work. That involves everyone between 16 and 65, outside of military and jails and mental institutions. The others cannot work. And this proportion, this total civil population available for work is divided to labor force and discouraged workers, so people who are outside of the labor force. Labor force is divided to employed, people who have a full-time job, and unemployed. Or those who don't have jobs but are trying actively to get one. Now, there are 3 statistical measures. As I said, unemployment rate, employment rate, and labor market participation rate. Now, having in mind this chart here, now we can say more precisely, we can define or determine how all of these 3 important statistical measures, aka estimates, are made. First, the unemployment rate, the most widely used one, arguably the most significant one of the 3. It's very simple. Unemployment rate is the number of unemployed people any given week, divided by the labor force. So the number of unemployed divided by the sum of employed and unemployed. By the sum of the number of unemployed and number of employed. So it's a percentage, of course, always. So lower the number of unemployed people, all other things being equal, the unemployment rate will be lower. So what you typically want as a macroeconomic analyst, when you gauge the health of an economy, actually the unemployment rate is one of the good parameters because it tells you how efficiently the labor resource is used in a given society. If a great percentage of a labor force is out of job, that tells you that the productive capacities are not used efficiently, that you are missing a large amount of output that have been produced by those people being employed. So that's one important piece of the data that you need in order to gauge the health of the labor market. Employment rate is the second one. And you might think that it's logical to say, okay, then employment rate would be number of employed people divided by labor force. No, that's not correct. The employment rate is the number of employed people divided by this, by total civil population. Okay, available. So that's an important distinction here. And employment rate is a percentage, is a number of employed people as a percentage of total non-institutionalized civil population. Why is this so? You will understand why is this calculated in this way when I introduce you to third measure. And the second and the third are just two ways of expressing the same information, essentially. For now, just remember that employment rate is calculated as a number of employed over total civil population. Yes. And the third one is labor market participation rate. What is that? That's this divided by this. It's labor force over total civil population. Why is this an important statistics? What do you think? So labor market participation rate is a percentage of total civil non-institutionalized population that is part of the labor force, that is either employed or unemployed. So what is left here? Labor force and the number of people who are outside of the labor market, who don't even try to find a job, who legally qualify for work, but who are not even trying to find a job. So then what information this particular estimate gives you is how optimistic or how pessimistic or how desperate and despondent population is about their employment prospects. So if you have a very high labor market participation rate, it means that you have a very few people, a very low number of people who are discouraged, who are outside of the labor market. People who are unemployed are people who are trying to find a job. So those are not desperate people. People who are outside of the labor market, typically what happens to them is that they try, not always, but very often, more likely than not, more often than not, they try to find a job for a week, 2 months, 2, 3, and then after a while they give up. And they drop out of the labor force. So the unemployment statistic doesn't catch them. They drop out. The unemployment statistics only shows the relationship between the number of people who are unemployed and total labor force, which is people who work plus people who are actively searching for a job. Those who dropped out from the labor market, they're not part of the unemployment statistics. So then you can have hidden unemployment. You can theoretically have, and not only theoretically, practically. I'll give you in a second one very good example of this situation. You can have a very low or a reasonably low unemployment rate and have a very low labor market participation rate, which means a huge number of these people here. So then that would be a hidden unemployment. Then the unemployment statistics wouldn't tell you the whole story about how the labor market is doing. Because you will be having a large number of people who are so desperate and pessimistic about their job prospects, so as to completely drop out. So then, in order to say, yeah, the labor market is in good shape, you need both a low unemployment rate, reasonably low unemployment rate, and a high labor market participation. So one example of this is that during the Obama era and larger part of Donald Trump's administration, many economists were worrying and talking about hidden unemployment in America. And then the unemployment figures were okay. They were very high when Obama took over, and then after 2 or 3 years, they're stabilizing and started going down, and it was like 4 or 5%. First 2 years or 2.5 years of Trump administration was less than 3% unemployment rate. It's very low. But many economists were not satisfied with this because the labor market participation rate went down significantly. And it went down in 2008, 2009, in the last big recession, financial crisis hit. Went down from something like 75, 76% to 63, 64%. So this labor market down to 64. So that's a huge drop. And it remained there for 10 years. So the unemployment rate started going down as we came out of recession in 2010, 2011. The unemployment rate was going down and down, but the participation rate hasn't gone up. Until 2018, I think, 2019 started inching up once again. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the situation is not as good as those rosy unemployment figures of 2 or 3 or 3.5%. They'll tell you that there are a huge number of people, a significant number of people who are completely outside of the labor. You want them back. So paradoxically, maybe a higher unemployment rate would be a good sign because it would mean that some of the people who are completely out of the system would be optimistic enough at least to try to find a job once again. So that's the reason why this labor participation rate, labor market participation rate, is necessary as a corrective or as a supplement. Yeah, it's a supplementary statistics to tell you a fuller story, to give you a fuller picture of the labor market. So this employment rate is another indirect indication of that. So the number of people who work is a percentage of this total civil population. It tells you indirectly how many people. Tells you directly some information about the size of the labor force vis-a-vis total civil population. It's a different way of measuring the same thing, the relationship between the size of the labor force and the size of the total civil population. So indirectly, what you want to measure is this thing here. So you can do it in this way, and in this way. This one is a more precise one, but this one also offers you some useful information. Okay, so these are the measurements. These are the estimates. These are the statistical tools, the most important statistical tools that economists use when they try to gauge the economic health of one of the most important segments of modern economy, that would be the labor market. Different kinds of unemployment statistics that taken together can give you a pretty good sense of what's going on in the economy. Any questions thus far? Okay. So then we're going to move on to the next topic here. Classification of different types of unemployment. So people can lose job, or people can be seeking jobs for different reasons. So unemployment is a state in which somebody who used to have a job loses the job, or is not employed anymore. There could be different reasons for that, and those different reasons will lead to different kinds of consequences, and will have to be treated separately as having different consequences. So you may lose your job, which means that you once were employed, and then you're fired or laid off, so you lose your job. or you can switch jobs, you can change. So you quit the job and you have another one lined up. So for a certain period of time, since unemployment statistics are compiled weekly, you technically be counted as unemployed. You see that's fundamentally different from you lose your job on which you worked 20 years and invested so much in acquiring the skills that are specific for that job, and your company goes bankrupt, and you're fired, you're laid off, and you don't have a job and you don't know what to do. Even if you know what to do, it will take you 1, 2, 3 years until you build new skills that are good enough to guarantee you similar income. Or you might be a Google software engineer and you got a better offer from Microsoft and you resign your position in Google and you wait for 3 weeks or a month to switch to Microsoft. During this intermediary period of 3 or 2 weeks, you are also unemployed. So both of these persons that I described are technically unemployed from a standpoint of statistical estimate. But you see the economic conditions and economic consequences of those two situations are fundamentally different. So this is the reason why we draw, there are just 2 more categories before I turn to this next topic. Somebody who is leaving job, somebody who is losing job. Then you have a category of somebody who is entering the market for the first time. And you enter the labor market, somebody who qualifies now. For example, you quit the military. You're now entering the labor market. Or you're 16 years old, you enter the labor market. So that's a new entrant in the labor market. Or maybe you dropped out of the labor market by whatever, failing to apply for the job for 6 months, and then you apply once again. You're re-entering the labor market. Okay, so those are some of the technical categories. Okay, now going back to our example here of Google engineer transferring to Microsoft for a better salary or better income, or somebody losing their job in a manufacturing plant 5 years before their retirement and not knowing what to do right now. So these 2 are fundamentally different. And then the types of unemployment that exist at the level of the macroeconomy as a whole would be different. So I'll remind you of something we discussed a great length. Production possibilities curve here. Let's say an economy is operating efficiently in the combination of goods that had to be traded off against each other, as such as to the final combinations are on this production possibilities frontier curve. And if that's not the case, for example, if your combination created is below the curve or to the left of the curve, we say typically that resources are not used with 100% efficiency. And one of the main examples of that we always use is that there is unemployment. Typically, what this situation describes is the existence of unemployment. So then, conversely, the condition of the efficient use of resources would be something called full employment situation. Now, you may think that, actually, what do you think? What is the unemployment rate in a full employment economy? Is it 0? Could it be 0? Why? Why not? It's a full employment. That should mean like 100%. In my book, if I understand the English language correctly, that should be something close to 100%. And it's never even close to 0. If it's 2%, people say, great, that's full employment economy. It's 2%, 3% unemployment. Why is that? Is that inevitable? Why? I think so. they always have some unemployment. This Google engineer is a good example, is a good hint where you should be looking for an answer.
Is it like when people are switching jobs, like they don't currently have a job, but they're
Yeah, just somebody is always going to be unemployed, no matter the reason. Even if you have a very good economy, at least first somebody will be losing job. Even in a very good economy, some companies will go bankrupt and somebody will lose. There is nothing perfect in this world. But even if you assume that away, there is another aspect here that people will be switching jobs. You don't have to lose your job in order to be unemployed, as you see. By be switching from an inferior job to a better job, and if there is a period of wait in between the two jobs, you will qualify as an unemployed person. So we know that some people are changing jobs all the time. So the unemployment statistics will never be what's the term? Yeah, the number will never be zero. So this unemployment that exists even in the full employment of resources, when the economy is operating at its maximum capacity, is called frictional unemployment. That means that there are frictions in the economy. The economy is not operating as a smooth machinery, well-oiled, in which nothing changes and there are no roadblocks and slowdowns. So you lose your job actually, or you quit. You're not going to find always job the very next day. There are costs of information about the better job that you want to find. So that's the reason why, even in the best of economic times, there will be some unemployment rate. And now the consensus, what is the number here, or the frictional unemployment, or unemployment consistent with the efficient operation of the economy? That's a different matter. It used to be considered that 2% is the number. Now people would be satisfied even with 3%. 3% is good enough in America. In Europe, it's much higher. That you'll see why that is. So this frictional unemployment sometimes is called also natural rate of unemployment. Another term means essentially the same in this context. Natural rate of unemployment, that means the economy is operating at full speed, at full capacity, but nature is what it is. The characteristics of our human existence are what they are. So we will always have some minimum level of unemployment stemming from the limitations we discussed. That's one. Now, there are different types of unemployment that are caused by some problems within the economy that signify that there is a certain structural problem within the economy. It's called structural unemployment. So that means the unemployment, the existing unemployment, is not caused only by the unavoidable frictions of the everyday economy, but by some other causes. And these causes could be twofold, could be technological, or brought about by the development in the market itself, technological changes in the market. Or they could be more often and more significantly caused by government policies. Government policies. So as to the first type of structural unemployment, people sometimes say that in the American Rust Belt there is a problem of structural unemployment. What is the main problem of Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Illinois? What is the main source? Michigan sometimes. There's a higher than expected unemployment rate in those areas. And there is a long-term unemployment problem. So if a region is heavily dependent on one branch of industry, and in fact, certain, go ahead, sir.
You mean like mining?
Yeah, it could be mining. So how mining creates problems of unemployment?
Like machinery replaces people going into the mine.
Or maybe the government closing down some of the coal mines as being environmentally unfriendly. And then it's not easy to find a kind of job if you're 50 years old and you don't have the other skills that are needed in modern economy. You might have a difficult time finding a new job. Or manufacturing, for example. Automation and technology, robotization, they decrease the demand for human labor in manufacturing. And then those heavily manufacturing in Western states, automobile industry and other industries, they have a problem. Some of the labor force that is specialized for this, they have a trouble adjusting to modern service-based and knowledge-based economy. So that could create the problems of higher than expected unemployment rate because of the difficulties of transition from one type of work to another type of work. But in general, this kind of problem is relatively less pronounced. It could be, its market takes care of itself in the long run. Some people will suffer, some people will have a more costly transition, but eventually they are going to transition. Big problem is if the government makes job creation more difficult for entrepreneurs. It's one of the stories that I always use, and I need to demonstrate this, is a personal anecdote. It was stuck in my mind, something that happened to me 12 years ago. And I asked people, why do you think, first, what do you think, what is the unemployment rate in America when there is no recession and there is full employment? And the economy is doing great. What was it before the pandemic began last year? It's less than 3%. I think it was 2.6%. You know, what is the really, really good unemployment figure in countries like France and Italy? They're doing great.
8 or 9.
Yeah, 8 or 9. It used to be more than 10, and then they changed this, the method of calculating the unemployment number. They got it. Yeah, it's exactly what they did 10 years ago. But it's still 8 or 9%. Why is that? Yeah, go ahead.
More restrictive labor laws and a greater welfare state.
Okay, so how does that affect how does that contribute to higher unemployment?
It's harder for people to like move jobs or find jobs.
Yeah.
Or for companies to hire.
So it's trade unions, number one. Protection, job protection is extremely strong. That means it's very difficult. Once you hire somebody full time, it's hell of a job to fire that person. It may be more profitable to pay this person for 6 months, like 70–80%, than to go through the administrative procedure to fire them. The anecdote I mentioned is actually my cousin lives in France. He's born based in France, and he used to work as a kind of software guy in one company. I think it was BMW, 10–12 years ago. And he was about to be laid off. There was no need for his services anymore. I don't know whether it was a crisis in 2008. I think it was economic crisis began. And I would call him from time to time. We were close. 5 days, and one day I would call him and ask, "What are you doing?" "I'm on work." He says, "Okay, I'll call you later." "So don't worry. I sit here and playing Nintendo, playing some video games." "What are you doing?" "Oh, playing video games. I sit here and I'm going to be staying here for 3 or 4 more months. they're going to pay me 70% of my salary for doing nothing. Literally. For doing nothing. Why? Because it costs them more to go through the administrative procedure that might take more than 4 months. And to pay for lawyers and for everything even more, it's not worth it. It's cheaper for his employer to pay him 70% of his regular salary for doing nothing rather than to try and fire him later. So now you may think to yourself for a moment what kind of incentives that creates for somebody who wants to offer a permanent full-time contract to anybody. If you know that if you want to fire that person, it's going to be a big problem. It's going to be an extremely costly and protracted process. So you're going to be hiring far fewer people to begin with. So see, that's this weird perverse dialectic of job protection that many people in America want to have. Greater job security. The price of greater job security is higher unemployment rate and lower rate of new job creation. It's not the accident in America every year. We are adding millions of new private sector jobs. Whereas in Europe, apart from Great Britain, it stagnates. The main reason, one of the key reasons for that, is the restrictive labor laws that make it very difficult to fire somebody. So obstacles to firing people are obstacles to hiring people. That's difficult. Also, welfare state. If you have an unemployment, if you lose your job and then the government pays you 70 or 80%, sometimes in some cases more than 100% of what you would be earning, would you be seeking new job very quickly, very promptly? Not really. So that's another reason why you have generous welfare benefits and unemployment insurance that are not conditioned on your actual job seeking. You will have a higher unemployment rate. So labor laws, minimum wage laws, trade union protections, high unemployment insurance payments, all of those create inferior incentives for job creation and higher unemployment rate. That's the reason why they never go beyond 7, 8%, 9%. Many countries in Western Europe. Even Germany has a higher unemployment rate. It's difficult to find more conscientious and hard-working people in the world, say for Japanese people, than Germans. Still, Germans have a higher unemployment rate than Americans. Well, that tells you something. They say usually that socialism doesn't work. How do you know that it doesn't work? The Germans tried it in Eastern Germany and they couldn't make it work. If Germans cannot make something work, it was not meant to work. So if unemployment rate in Germany is 5%, that means that those policies that are common to Germany and France and Italy, labor market protection and so on, are the real problem and the real cause of structural. So this is structural unemployment. This is something that can change if the incentives change, if they adopt a more kind of Anglo-Saxon, more flexible labor market regulations. Their unemployment rate will go down as well. Okay, there are 2 or 3 more nuances here about the unemployment that we're going to discuss on Friday, and then we're going to be finished with this introductory stuff about measurements. Are there any final questions or comments? Anything? Okay, this is still doubting. There shouldn't be much problem. Okay, then I'll see you all on Friday.
Yeah, I might have to go out to you on Friday.
Okay. Yeah.
Today, actually.
Today? Oh, goodness. That's scary. Are you excited to find out though, like what?
Yeah, I just want to be fully touching it.
Huh? That's kind of scary. Yeah, I don't wanna go.
And then there's,
No, I can't go. Oh, so then you're gonna have to stay on crutches?
send me an
You
email.
just
Probably just left that
Hopefully it goes well.
And I don't know.
And you're not working. Yeah.
Like in my class.
Yeah, you are, you want.
Would it be the labor force or?
It's labor
No, thank you. How you feeling? Do I read everything? Yeah, I was like. There's only two like exams and then notes, like that. I've had nursing this for 4 exams. Yeah, really, like, just it says 34 minutes. Never had someone else.
What course is this?
This is ethics.
Really? Oh, 'cause it's. Really? What time is it?
It is one.
Oh, it's one. Oh, yeah, okay. I thought it was two.
Definitely feel that, been there.
So much would lay down my life for him.
It's kind of dark in here today.
Yeah.